Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Prepare for a rant. Wizard of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast. If ever there was a company that successfully managed to piss off its client base in record time, they have taken the cake this week. I mean, wow. If it wasn't just so goddamn scummy, I would be very, very impressed. Suffice to say, if you're watching this, you may have heard or be curious about what happened with this new open games license that they were trying to push down our throats. So, a little bit of background. Back in the 3rd edition days, the open games license was what Wizards of the Coast licensing out bits of the non-copyrightable parts of the D20 system that they were using to third-party publishers and to whoever else wanted to create stuff that was compatible with 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons. So, a vast ecosystem of D20 products came out from that. Some would say too vast, depending on your opinion on that particular era. There's a lot of shovelware, as you can imagine. But that changed a little bit with the coming of 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, which, among other things, introduced the game system license, the GSL, an attempt to recreate another licensing system for 4th edition, which it turns out was a lot more restrictive than the OGL that came previously. That, in combination with the rule changes to 4th edition that made it vastly less popular with the established player base, well, it meant that fewer people published for it, fewer people created stuff for it, and fewer people bought it. It also resulted in a whole bunch of people going back to older systems, like, older, like basic expert D&D and AD&D and such, and using the OGL to recreate those in more modern forms. You had Osric, Labyrinth Lord, currently you have games like, Old School Essentials and stuff like that, as well as, others that took those systems and then just ran with them. Lamentations of the Flame Princess, Axe, Adventure Conqueror King, which we'll discuss a little bit later, as we'll see. All these Dungeon Crawl classics, all these different games that were born out of going back to those earlier systems of earlier versions of Dungeons & Dragons and going off in their own directions, spinning off in their own directions with them. This is where Pathfinder came from. And for a time, it supplanted Dungeons & Dragons as the #1 big swinging dick in the RPG world. That's, end result of that particular mistake on Wizards of the Coast part. After this, of course, you had, 5th edition came out. They stuck back to the original OGL. But now, with the coming of oned&d, D&D 6th edition, D&D Beyond, whatever the hell you want to call it, you now end up with a situation where they have recreated the GSL on steroids. The leaked version, which was confirmed by people at Kickstarter as being an actual real document, was not only incredibly restrictive, but also goddamn predatory, just unbelievably bad, to the point where I can't think of anyone sane and who would, in their right mind, would ever want to sign up for this thing if they absolutely had to. I mean, goddamn. I mean, just the fact that they own your IP and can use it as they see fit if you sign this thing. I'm not kidding. There's some serious, shenanigans with regards to that. I won't go into too much detail because I am not a legal expert on this. There are other people online on YouTube and elsewhere who have gone into far greater detail and with far greater expertise into this to be able to tell you. But I have to say this: after reading this thing, I would not, if I were a third party creator for D&D and RPG stuff, I would not touch this thing with a 10-foot pole, pun literally included. And if ever I wanted to cover Wizard of the Coast products on this channel, which I haven't because they don't really make anything that I want to cover, because I have very particular tastes, I would not. Even if they recreated a new edition of Dark Sun with big old swinging titties on every single page, no. I might probably, sail the high seas for it, yar, but I definitely would not be giving them any money at this point. And because this is not the first time they've done this, the aforementioned GSL, that was the same kind of situation. Now it's just the same thing, except worse. After the massive negative reaction that's resulted to the point where many people are stripping OGL licensing from their products or going in for new editions that will not include OGL content of any kind, or in the case of Paizo, coming up with their own license, the Open Role-Playing Creative License, or ORC, pun very much intended, I love that. So the Wizard of the Coast has finally come out with a rather late in the hour response, and it is exactly the same kind of mealy-mouthed, corporate, ass-covering non-apology you can imagine from this. It's scummy politician speak. You know what I mean? That kind of stuff. It's exactly what was expected at this point from them. And it is very much an indication that we're very sorry you're upset. We're going to keep doing this, what we're doing, but we're very sorry we're upset. We care about the game and about you. No, they don't. They do not. I don't care who you are, what you believe, where you stand politically, or anything like that. Make no mistake, these people do not care about you. They care about what's in your wallet. They care about making sure that goes into their wallet. That is the only thing that matters. Not the color of your skin, not what's swinging between your legs, and not who you happen to want to be able to marry someday. None of that matters. This is the same kind of thing that you see every Pride Month when you see various companies change their logo to a nice rainbow color in all the markets except the ones where it's not profitable to do so. Make no mistake, these corporations, even if they make the stuff that you love, do not care about you. Do not let them convince you otherwise. Don't split the party on this one, people. That's how you end up, with a TPK. And another thing here, don't give these people money. Do not. I know it might be hard depending on, where you're gaming, if you have people who are only interested in playing the latest and greatest Dungeons and Dragons because they saw it on Stranger Things or been watching, Matt Mercer as a show, Critical Role. I understand it can be difficult to get people to be interested in other RPGs, which is why I have some recommendations. So, instead of D&D, what else can we play? Well, there's the aforementioned OSR games. So, personal recommendations from me. First off, Adventurer Conqueror King. This is possibly my favorite D&D related system. I've already interviewed the author Alexander Macris on my show when his other RPG Ascendant, which is for superheroes, came out. That one's also really cool too. And this one came up here. This one is very much a fantasy world simulator. If you're the kind of person who enjoys Mountain Blade or Crusader Kings, especially Crusader Kings, you're going to love this. This one is very much, it takes that heavy simulation aspect of role-playing games and really goes in on that, using the basic expert D&D as the foundational chassis. And it takes that and expands on it. It expands the domain level play. It expands the world-building system to create a grounded universe that that is internally consistent as much as possible, well, as much as a world with dragons and magic and such can be. And that allows you to really answer questions that, your players might have. Okay, I'm going to this city. How many mercenaries can I hire? Well, it's this kind of size of city with this kind of, trade routes. Okay, this is the amount roll for that. Okay, this is the amount of mercenaries that are currently on hire. Here's their particular qualities, what equipment they might have. Here's how much it's going to cost. And then it's up to you to decide, okay, do I have the amount of resources necessary to be able to feed these mercenaries on the march? Or are they going to have to start rolling morale rolls to see if they're going to just, screw off and go work for somebody else? There's a lot of rules for, exploring and creating your own kingdoms from the ground up in game. Nothing, there's no meta currencies or anything like that. It's very much all from the perspective of the player characters in world. That's very much the simulation aspect of it. And if you really want, if you're like me and you enjoy your fantasy far more in the Conan style, Heroic Fantasy Handbook has got you covered there. It's got some serious, reworkings of the magic system to make it far more like creepy ceremonial stuff, some new rules for proficiencies and such. It's easy to work and play, and it keeps that D&D feel, but also has its own style to it, which I think if you were fans of the aforementioned video games that I mentioned, you're going to love this. Oh, and you can totally do Dwarf Fortress in this, and he just came out with a book all about dwarves. Dwarf Fortress fans? Axe. You've been told. So, maybe you're not interested in something quite so grounded. Maybe you want something that is far more gonzo, far more, unpredictable and crazy. Well, for that, This is Dungeon Crawl Classics by Goodman Games. Don't be fooled by the size of this book. It is actually a very simple system. It's, far more simple even than, D&D 5th edition, I would say. But what comes with this is the fact that magic is also done in a very particular way. Each spell has its own table of results that can occur when it's cast, and those can range from, complete failure, catastrophic failure that causes some serious, consequences, or, funny consequences for the player, or absolute apocalyptic mass demonstrations of mystical power that can just completely turn the tide and possibly cause even more complications than you were expecting. I mean, the skill system in this game is 2 pages, so that should tell you something about where the focus is, and it's very much focused on recreating the feel of the original source material that inspired Dungeons and Dragons, the eponymous Appendix N kind of things, and the whole system, as well as the adventures, of which there are numerous adventures written for this game, is very much focused on recreating that feel to it, that unpredictable, I don't know what's going to happen next kind of feel to the adventures. It's got its own concepts as well, like the funnel, which is the first adventure that your players would go on, where each one, instead of having a first level character, has a bunch of 0 level peasants who are now being forced to go on into the adventure themselves and have the survivability of, well, let's just say that the survival rate for 0 level characters is not particularly good, and leave it at that. Suffice to say that by the end of that adventure, you've got a bunch of first level characters. It's just you're not exactly sure which ones are going to be surviving. And it adds that unpredictability, which is the cornerstone of this particular system. However, they also have some really cool other stuff. For instance, they've licensed a lot of actual sword and sorcery settings. You've got Lankmar, which was previously licensed by in AD&D of all places, as well as Savage Worlds has also got their own Lankmar version of the Lankmar setting, which is the setting created by Fritz Leiber for his Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser stories, which are classic sword and sorcery. Highly recommend. This one's fun. Of course, it helps to have some play. This helps for all sword and sorcery style gaming. It helps to have players that aren't going to be complete cowards and will actually do stuff. It always helps. You definitely do not want a bunch of pansies who are just going to sit back and just, I don't want to get my character killed. Roll a new one. It's not that hard. There. Now, what if you want something that's not quite as simulationist as Axe and not quite as crazy gonzo as Dungeons & Crawl Classics? This is Hyperborea. This is the 2nd edition, referred to as Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea. The 3rd edition is, which I don't physically have, is just called Hyperborea. That was in 2 separate books, DM and Player's Guide, versus the one all-encompassing version I've got here. This one has, the setting itself is very gonzo, but the system itself is almost like AD&D 1st, 2nd edition kind of feel to it, with its own particular tweaks and changes based on the available races, the available classes. There's a lot of different classes in this. That's very much a AD&D 2nd edition kind of feel to it. The world itself of this setting takes place on a chunk of Earth that was ripped off the surface and sent flying into orbit around Saturn by means unknown. Yeah, like I said, the setting is kind of weird, but it is also very much prime material for the sword and sorcery game. There's a lot of references to Howard, of course, Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, which is always a pleasure to see. And the setting itself, includes a lot of different kinds of peoples and ethnicities and different people. It's all humans. There are no elves and dwarves that are playable in this game. But you have a bunch of different people that have been ripped off from Earth and assembled here in Hyperborea, and by forces unknown. And there's lots of strange things happening. You have alien super science mixed with eldritch sorcery, and it's very much that kind of setting. But it's one that, thanks to the system, takes itself a bit more seriously than, say, something like Dungeon Crawl Classics, which is far more, gonzo craziness. So yeah, this one I also highly recommend looking into. Now, these ones are all very much D&D. If you want to go outside of that, perhaps something a bit more simple, I recommend Barbarians of Lemuria. This is the French edition, of course my favorite edition, by Ludospheric. You can find obviously the English editions. I just happen to really like this one because I enjoy the way it's presented, and I also enjoy the art. All the art is by an artist named Emmanuel Roudier, and it is goddamn gorgeous, and frankly superior to pretty much every other edition I've been able to find of this thing. Originally, the free version of this, created by Simon Washburn years ago, was based on the Thongor of Lemuria stories by Lynn Carter. Now, since then, all the serial numbers have been filed off, and the commercial version is not directly referencing it, although it is obviously similar in many ways. And it is very simple. It's perhaps a bit too simple for certain people. One of the things that you have to remember about rules-light systems is that they're going to require a lot of rulings from your GM when they're playing them, because certain things happen that aren't necessarily covered by the rules and require a bit of arbitration there. That's it's just the question there is to be consistent with your rulings, and remember previous ones. Just write them down. You don't want to just make shit up all the time. It's very important to keep consistency in these things. But yeah, the system itself is very simple. 2D. You just need some D6s for this one. The skill system. It's not a class-based system like these ones. This one is definitely skill-based, but it's based on the career paths of your characters. You just select various careers and assign them a numerical value for how important they were in your life, the amount of time spent in them, the amount of effort spent into them. So you can create the kind of career path that, say, Conan has, where you have barbarian, thief, pirate, mercenary. Like if we're starting characters, you start with 4 different careers. And just like him, where he went for a variety of different career paths during his life, eventually ending up as king of Aquilonia. And here it's the same kind of thing. You create characters that from the start are very powerful compared to their opposition, who are typically just like mooks that go down in a hit or two. But it still has a lot of flavor to it in spite of being fairly simple. So Barbarians of Lemuria, another thing that's really good about it, the magic system is completely open. There are no specific spells as such, but depending on the magnitude of the spell that you're casting, it'll require to have different requirements, such as maybe simply having particular reagents, or particular movements that are requiring you to meditate for a certain amount of time in order to prepare yourself for the spell casting, or of course the classic human sacrifice on a particular time at a particular location to cause something particularly nasty to happen, which is usually interrupted by sword-wielding barbarians, as you can imagine. It's very much that kind of game, and man, I love the art in this thing. It's very evocative, and the best part is this particular version also has some additional supplements for it, as you can see here. The Lemurian Chronicles and the Veiled God. These ones are available in English by through DriveThruRPG, so if you're not particularly good with your French, there are ways of getting around that. Now, if you want something that's not D&D but is a bit more on the lines of the complexity of the previously mentioned ones, I recommend also this one right here. This is Mithras by Design Mechanism, and it is previously known as RuneQuest 6th Edition. The license moved on to back to Chaosium after that, but it is very much compatible with anything that they're making for that system, and fairly compatible with previous editions of RuneQuest as well, like Mongoose's version, which became Legend RPG. And it is a D100 based system, as you can imagine from it being RuneQuest derived. And it is very much a fantasy world toolbox. It has a lot of different options that you can do. You're going to want to tailor the available magic, available weapons and armor, available stuff to the setting that you're creating for, that you're going to be using it for. Because, as universal RPGs like this one are obviously going to require that kind of fine-tuning to be exactly what you want for your world. Now, it comes out with another thing for the D&D crowd called Classic Fantasy, which is basically this system adapted to a more D&D style world, which is, useful in this case. If you're more interested in branching out from there, they have a book called Monster Island, which is a complete setting supplement for Mithras, which is very much focused on my kind of fantasy world. It is sword and sorcery, dark magic, serpent men in their high towers, wielding unearthly powers and enslaving the poor humans and strange creatures around them, horrifying monsters, sleeping gods buried under the ground, being kept asleep through the tribal rituals of lizard men. I mean, There's some cool stuff in this thing. Yeah. And it's got some very good tips and instructions for how to use this kind of sword and sorcery environment for this particular system. So it's worth picking up in that regard. Other things that are worth picking up by Design Mechanism also the Mythic Earth settings. These ones are not fantasy settings. These are our world as seen from the perspective of the people of it at the time. So you have, like for instance, this one, they have Mythic Rome, they've done Mythic Britain, Constantinople, Babylon. Each one of these goes into pretty good detail about the lives of the people, the social structure, their political structure, what people did for fun, what people did for their religious beliefs, magic beliefs, because people believed in magic back then, and then goes ahead and stats it out. So you have the creatures of legend that people believed existed in those cultures, the kinds of divinations they did and how those stat up and how you can use them for your player characters, the skills and weapons and all these kinds of things. These kinds of books they remind me of the old AD&D 2nd edition historical books that they also had for those, where it's not just useful for the setting, but it's also a good reference for the actual historical period, but focus more on what would be useful for in a role-playing game. So it's pretty useful in that. This is just a small tidbit of games that I have on hand here. And there is a vast, vast world of RPGs out there outside of Dungeons & Dragons, which I highly recommend looking at. I know that for a lot of people, when they think role-playing games, they only think D&D. They either have never been exposed to the wider tabletop RPG world or simply have not been interested. I mean, there are a lot of people who just, go for the first thing that comes up and stick with it, whether they, saw it just through cultural osmosis or watching Stranger Things or just watching Critical Role and catching that on YouTube or something. But it's important to realize that there's more out there than just the corporate role-playing game du jour. And there's so much more out there that deserves your eyeballs far more than Dungeons & Dragons. Because Dungeons & Dragons is no longer Dungeons & Dragons anymore. It's no longer just a game. It's this lifestyle brand that Wizards of the Coast is trying to nickel and dime us over. I mean, it's just not worth giving them their money over. Simply not. Don't buy stuff from Wizards of the Coast. They don't give a shit about you. They don't give a shit about their hobby. They don't give a shit about your game. It's simple as that. They may talk a good game. They may say the right words for, corporate PR reasons and say, oh, we want this great inclusive community. No, they don't. If they could make more money and get better PR by being non-inclusive and forgetting them and ignoring all the, people that they cater to, they would do it. Simple as that. Don't make the mistake of thinking that a for-profit capitalistic corporation is going to be in line with any of the particular progressive beliefs that they claim to be behind. Remember, you got whenever Pride Month comes in, you got the corporate logos on the social media for all the countries where being, pro LGBT is favorable to their bottom line, and then you look at the ones on all the other parts of the world where they don't change it for that month because it's not profitable for their bottom line. Here endeth the lesson. Don't let this kind of shit, divide a united front that we currently have. They're going to try to use that because, let's face it, it's worked in the past for a lot of things. But don't split the party on this one. That's how you get TPKs. Here endeth the lesson. I've been Zero Sum. Like, share, subscribe, and all that crap. Fuck WotC, and I'll see you next time.